My daughter-in-law threw my late wife's photo album across my living room floor and told me I was a pathetic, lonely old man who needed to stay out of their lives. That was a Tuesday evening in October, 11 days before my 64th birthday. Wednesday morning, I sent her one text. "Come over. I have something that belongs to you." She drove 40 minutes from their place thinking I was going to apologize. When she walked through my front door and saw what I'd laid out on my kitchen table, every bit of color drained out of her face. Before we get there, let me tell you how we ended up in that kitchen. I spent 38 years as a licensed electrician in the Nashville area. Built a reputation, built a business, built the house my wife and I lived in for 26 years out near Hendersonville with my own hands. My wife passed away 22 months ago. Congestive heart failure. She was 61. We had one son, and he married his wife about 4 years before his mother died. I wanted to love her. I tried to love her. For a long time, I told myself I did. The first time I noticed something was off was at my grandson's 3rd birthday party, about 6 months after my wife passed. I showed up with a gift, a toolbox with real child-sized tools the way my father had given me one at 3 years old. My daughter-in-law took it from me at the door, smiled the way people smile in job interviews, and said, "Oh, Ray, you shouldn't have." I found it in the trash can by the garage on my way out, still in the wrapping paper. I told myself it was an accident. 4 months later, my son called me. He sounded tired in a way I recognized from when he was a teenager, and something was wrong, but he couldn't say it directly. "Dad, I just want to check in. You doing okay? You're not like showing up places without calling first, right?" I didn't understand the question. I asked him what he meant. Long pause. Nothing. Never mind. She's just been feeling a little overwhelmed with the kids. I said I understood. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for about 10 minutes trying to figure out what I'd supposedly done. Over the next 8 months, I got a slow education in being managed. Plans that got canceled an hour before I was supposed to arrive. Holidays that were just us this year, Dad. The kids are exhausted from travel. My granddaughter's kindergarten performance that I heard about from my neighbor, whose daughter happened to be in the same class 2 days after it happened. When I mentioned it to my son, he went quiet. Said he'd told his wife to put it on the calendar for me. Said he was sure she did. I started keeping notes. Old electrician habit. You document everything, because the job that seemed fine is the one that burns down a house 3 years later. By September, I had a notebook with 16 incidents. Not confrontational stuff, just dates, what was said, what I observed. I'm not a dramatic man. I don't rage. My wife used to say I processed everything so slowly and quietly that she sometimes wondered if I was still in there. I told her I was just running the wiring. Had to find the short before you could fix it. The Tuesday in October started like a normal visit. I'd called ahead. My son was working late, but my daughter-in-law said to come by. The kids wanted to see me. I brought ingredients and made spaghetti with my grandkids the way my wife used to do with my son when he was small. My grandson wore half of it. My granddaughter told me I was her favorite person in the universe, which I'm aware is what 5-year-olds say, but it still got me right in the chest. After the kids were in bed, my daughter-in-law poured herself a glass of wine and sat across from me at the kitchen table. The energy shifted. I've been around enough job sites to know when the ground under you changes. "Ray, I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Her voice was careful, practiced. "I think we need to set some clearer expectations for the kids, for Marcus, for everyone." I said I was listening. "You have a habit of making things about you. Coming over unannounced. Calling Marcus when he's trying to focus at work, bringing gifts that aren't on the approved list, inserting yourself into decisions that are ours to make." She smiled pleasantly the whole time. "I think you have a lot of grief you haven't dealt with, and it's causing you to lean on us in ways that aren't healthy for our family." I said I hadn't come over unannounced in 7 months. "You came by last Thursday without texting first." I told her I'd called my son from the driveway, and he'd said to come in. She blinked once. He shouldn't have done that, like he'd violated a policy. I picked up my jacket from the chair back, said I thought I'd better go, and that we could all talk when my son was home. She stood up. Everything about the practice calm was gone. "No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to make me feel like the unreasonable one and then just walk out. Marcus agrees with me. He's just too soft to say it. You're suffocating us, and you've been doing it since she died, and frankly it was starting before that." I turned around. "She spoiled you." My daughter-in-law's voice got tight. "Always calling, always making sure Ray was okay, always putting you first. And now she's gone, and you expect us to fill that hole. And we can't. We have children, we have a life. And I am done pretending that your neediness is something I have to accommodate. There was more. I'm leaving out the worst of it because this isn't about the words. At some point, she picked up the photo album my son kept on the end table, the one his mother had put together of his childhood, and she flung it. Not at me, just away from her, the way people do when they lose the thread. It hit the floor, and 3 pages bent. I picked it up, set it on the table, put on my jacket, drove home. I didn't cry until I was in my driveway. I'm not ashamed of that. My wife would have told me that was healthy progress over the version of me she married who would have held it until a pulled muscle in 2009. I sat with it for a few hours. Then I went to the filing cabinet in my home office. My wife was methodical. She kept records the way I kept records. It's one of the things that made us work. After she passed, I'd gone through her files to handle the estate, but I hadn't gone all the way through. There'd been a folder I'd set aside marked Marcus' future in her handwriting. I hadn't been able to open it for the first year. That night I opened it. Inside were statements from a savings account I hadn't known she'd opened. She'd been putting money in it since Marcus was born. 41 years of small deposits, Christmas bonuses, birthday money from her mother. The balance at her last statement, dated 2 months before she died, was $62,000. The account had been set up to transfer jointly to me upon her death, or, if I predeceased her, to Marcus directly. There were 3 signatories listed: my wife, me, and Marcus. I checked the most recent statement, which had arrived in her old mail stack I'd been slowly sorting. The account had been closed 14 months ago. Balance at closing, 0. I sat at that desk until about 3 in the morning. I am not a man who acts fast. Some people read that as weakness. It is not. It is how you avoid burning down the house. In the morning, I called a woman I'd done electrical work for about 8 years prior. She was an estate attorney. I'd wired her office building and she'd given me her card. I'd never thought I'd use it for something like this. She picked up on the second ring, remembered me immediately, told me to come in that afternoon. I spread everything on her conference table, the folder, the statements, the timeline I'd put together that morning while the coffee brewed. She read without speaking, made 2 notes on her legal pad. This account, she said, tapping the statement. Were you notified when it closed? No. I hadn't known it existed until the night before. Were you aware of any transfers prior to closing? No. She set down her pen. Ray, your name is on this as joint account holder. You had a right to be notified of activity. If you weren't, and if withdrawals were made without your authorization, we're looking at something more serious than a family disagreement. I asked her what she meant by more serious. She said she needed to pull the full transaction history first. She could do that with a simple request given my status as joint account holder. She'd have it in 24 hours. I drove home and did not contact my son or daughter-in-law. That was harder than it sounds. I had 23 text messages from my son by then, varying between confused and hurt. Apparently she'd told him what she said to me. His version of events, based on his texts, seemed to involve me saying things I had not said. He kept writing, Dad, why would you go after her like that? I stared at that question for a long time without responding. The account history arrived the next afternoon. My attorney walked me through it over the phone. 3 large withdrawals over a period of 8 months, totaling $58,000, all made via a linked checking account that belonged to my daughter-in-law and my son jointly. The final withdrawal, which zeroed the account, was made 4 days after my wife's funeral. 4 days. I had to put down the phone and walk outside, stood on my back porch and looked at the field behind my property for a while. The grass needed cutting. My wife used to like when I cut it because she said she could smell it from her reading chair by the window. When I went back inside, I called my attorney and told her to send me whatever she needed me to sign. Then I texted my daughter-in-law. Come over. I have something that belongs to you. Intentionally vague, intentionally calm. She drove over the next morning. She came in with the posture of someone who'd prepared a speech, the look of a person ready to receive an apology. I let her sit down at my kitchen table. I poured her coffee she didn't ask for. Then I laid down the account statements, the transaction history, and a letter from my attorney outlining the findings. She looked at it, looked at me, looked at it again. The speech she'd prepared went away. A different version of her appeared. Marcus handles our finances. I slid the signature card across the table. Her signature, notarized. adding her to the linked checking account 4 months before my wife passed. She stood up, said this was a misunderstanding, said Marcus had explained the account to her, that his mother had wanted them to use it, said my wife had told her directly. I asked her if she had that in writing. She left without finishing her coffee. My attorney filed the civil claim that week. I didn't tell my son beforehand. I know how that looks. I'll tell you why. Because every time I'd tried to talk to my son about his wife in the last 2 years, the conversation had ended the same way, with me apologizing for something I didn't do. I needed him to see the documents before he heard her version of what they meant. I needed him to be standing in front of facts he couldn't rearrange. My son called me that night. He was not calm. Dad, you're suing my wife. My wife? Do you understand what you're doing? I told him I wasn't suing her. I was pursuing recovery of jointly held assets that were transferred without my knowledge or consent. That's the same thing. I told him to look at the dates. His mother's funeral was on a Saturday. The account was closed the following Wednesday. Did he know that? Silence. Did he authorize those transfers? More silence. She said Mom wanted us to have it. She said Mom talked to her. I asked him to think about whether his mother had ever discussed that account with him, ever mentioned it, ever included him in a conversation about it. The silence stretched long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. I have to go, he said. He hung up. I won't pretend that wasn't one of the harder nights since my wife passed. I sat in my kitchen and thought about a version of this where I just let it go. $62,000. My wife's life savings for her son. Let it go. Keep the peace. Watch my granddaughter's performances from the footage, she texted me 3 days later. I poured bourbon I don't usually drink and thought about that version for about an hour. Then I thought about my wife sitting across a bank officer's desk 40 years ago, filling out that initial deposit form with $25 from her first paycheck at the school district job she took so Marcus could have options. She worked that job until 2 years before she died. She used to say it wasn't about the money. It was about keeping something safe for him, something no bad year or broken appliance or medical bill could touch. 4 days after her funeral, I poured the bourbon back. What I didn't anticipate was that my daughter-in-law would be fast. She called my son's best friend from college, a man who'd stood in my living room at my wife's reception and hugged me, and said she was the best woman he'd ever known outside of his own mother. She told him I was having some kind of grief-related breakdown, that I'd always been controlling and her marriage had suffered for years, that the lawsuit was harassment. He called me 2 days later, not to accuse, just to ask. I've known him since he was 22 years old. He drove down from Louisville for my wife's funeral and stayed through the weekend to help me clean up. When he asked, I told him everything. Sent him the documents. He went quiet the same way my son had gone quiet. Ray, he said, she asked me for money last year. I hadn't known that. Said Marcus was embarrassed to ask, that he had some business debts, that they just needed $8,000 to get clear. Said your wife had been helping them, and that you'd take it out of context if you knew. He exhaled. I gave it to her. I figured if Margaret was okay with helping them, then... He stopped. I said my wife's name very rarely since she passed. It tends to close my throat. Margaret didn't know, I told him. She couldn't have. The account she set up was for Marcus. It wasn't for business debts. Another long silence. I want to testify, he said. Whatever you need, I kept the texts. I kept everything. My attorney met with him the following week. He had screenshots of every conversation. The texts where my daughter-in-law referenced my wife by name, implying she had discussed the loan personally. The Venmo transfer. His own notes from the call because, like me, he was the type who wrote things down. The pattern that emerged was not complicated. My daughter-in-law was resourceful and persuasive, and she understood exactly how to use grief as a door. She'd approached 3 people in our extended circle in the 14 months since my wife passed, all with variations on the same story. Marcus's mother wanted this. Marcus is too proud to ask. Don't tell Ray. He'll misunderstand. Total extracted. Just over $80,000 between the estate account and the private loans. I felt sick knowing it. Then I felt something else, something older and quieter. I'd been asking myself for 2 years what I was missing. Why my son seemed to be drifting. Why holidays got harder. Why the kids seemed uncertain around me, like they'd been briefed on something. The answer had been in my filing cabinet the whole time, and I just hadn't gotten there yet. I made one mistake in this process. I want to be honest about it. 3 weeks after filing, I ran into my son's former soccer coach at Home Depot. We'd been friendly for 15 years. He'd heard something through the neighborhood, some version of what was happening, and he asked if I was okay. I told him more than I should have, not specifics, but enough. By that evening, 2 people had texted me asking if the rumors about my daughter-in-law were true. By the next morning, my son had called me twice and left one voicemail that I won't repeat here. My attorney called at 8 a.m. and did not sound pleased. "What did you say to Dale?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. "Ray, I need you to understand that I have given you one instruction throughout this entire process, and it was to not discuss this publicly." I said I knew. "I'm going to need you to not know it again." Because now her attorney has something to work with. They will say you are running a reputation campaign. They will say this is about revenge, not restitution. You have handed them a narrative. She was right. I'd been frustrated and I'd been tired and I'd run into Dale, and all of it had come out sideways at a hardware store. My wife would have given me a look she had, not angry exactly, more like the look a good electrician gives an apprentice who bypassed the breaker box. You know better than that. I called my attorney back and asked how bad the damage was. Manageable. But you don't get another mistake. I spent the following 3 weeks saying nothing to nobody. That was harder than it sounds when you're 63 and you've been dealing with something like this more or less alone. I called my wife's sister in Chattanooga twice just to hear a familiar voice. Didn't discuss the case. Just talked about her garden and what my grandkids had said last time I saw them, which was getting to be a while. My son wasn't returning my calls by then. I'd get a text every few days. Something short. "Dad, I just need some space right now." I'd reply that I understood, that I loved him, and leave it there. Some nights, I didn't fall asleep until 2. I'd sit in the chair my wife used to read in and look at the field out back and think about whether I was doing the right thing or just doing the stubborn thing, and whether those were as different as I'd always believed. The morning of the deposition, my daughter-in-law arrived with her attorney looking confident. I understand why. She had a version of events that was not crazy on its face. Grieving father-in-law misremembers conversations with his deceased wife. Son and wife believed they had permission. Accounts were accessible. Nobody committed fraud. This was a family misunderstanding weaponized by a man who couldn't let his son go. It was a coherent story. She told it clearly. Then my attorney put the signature card in front of her, the one adding her to the linked checking account. Dated 4 months before my wife died. She said Marcus had asked her to handle it. My attorney asked why Marcus's signature was not on that card. She said he'd been traveling. My attorney asked why neither of them had mentioned this account to me in the 14 months since my wife passed. She said they'd assumed I knew. My attorney put the closing transaction on the table next. 4 days after the funeral. She said they'd needed to close it quickly due to estate complications. My attorney asked what estate complications. My daughter-in-law's attorney objected. The question stood. Then my son's college friend gave his deposition. He had the texts. He had the Venmo record. He had the notes he'd made after the call. He was straightforward and uncomfortable and completely credible. He was not there for revenge. He was there because my wife had been kind to him when he was a young man with nowhere to go for Thanksgiving, and he thought she deserved better than to have her name used that way. Something shifted in that room after he testified. I can't point to one moment. It was more like the air changed. My daughter-in-law's attorney requested a recess. When we came back, the tone was different. My son came to see me 3 days later. I wasn't expecting him. He pulled into my driveway on a Wednesday afternoon, sat in his car for about 5 minutes before he came in. I handed him coffee and didn't say anything. He sat at the table where I'd laid out those documents 2 months before. She told me Mom wanted her to have it. He looked at the table. After the funeral, she sat me down and said Mom had talked to her, said she'd wanted us to have a real start, and that she'd set it aside for that. And he stopped. I was so tired of grieving. I just wanted to believe something good. His voice dropped. I didn't look. I should have looked. I told him that was on her, not him. I gave her access to everything, Dad. All of our accounts. Because I trusted her. Because she said she was better at the financial stuff, and I just let it happen. He looked up. She called me yesterday. She wants to work it out. She said, if I support her through this, she'll make everything right. I didn't say anything. Do you think she can? I told him I thought the most honest thing I could tell him was that I didn't know her well enough to answer that. And I believed I did. He nodded slowly. I know. He stood up, held out his hand. I shook it. Then he pulled me in for a hug, brief and stiff in the way of men who don't do it often enough. I'm sorry it took me this long. I said I was sorry it happened at all. The case settled 6 weeks later. My attorney negotiated restitution for the full amount, plus legal fees. The agreement included a formal acknowledgement of the unauthorized transfers. My daughter-in-law and my son separated during that process. I don't know if it's permanent. That's not mine to determine. My son is 40 years old, and whatever he decides about his marriage is a decision I have no standing to make for him. I told him that directly, and I meant it. What I know is this. 3 months after the settlement, I started keeping my grandson on Tuesday afternoons while my son works from home. We built a birdhouse that neither of us has any confidence will stay together through the first rain. My granddaughter calls me every Sunday to tell me what animal she currently wants to be when she grows up. Last week it was a geologist. The week before it was a cloud. I told her those were both solid choices. My wife's sister came up from Chattanooga the weekend after the settlement closed. We sat on my back porch and I cut the grass, and she sat in the chair my wife used to use and read a book. And it was the most peaceful Saturday I'd had in 2 years. Before she left, she told me she'd found something going through her sister's things. A card my wife had written to me, stamped but never mailed, from the last week before she went into the hospital the final time. My wife's sister had found it in a coat pocket while donating the coat, had recognized the handwriting on the envelope, and had kept it for 3 months before she could bring herself to give it to me. I read it that night. It was one side of one card. She wrote about the field behind the house. She wrote that she hoped I was cutting the grass because it helped me think. She wrote that whatever came next for our son, she trusted me to handle it the way I handled everything. Slow, steady, and without burning down any houses. I folded it back into the envelope and put it in the drawer with my notes. I am not going to tell you the outcome felt like winning. The word that comes to mind is accurate. Things returned to what they actually were, which is different from what they should have been, but at least no longer pretending to be something else. My son is a good man who loved his mother and trusted the wrong person with her memory. I am a man who waited too long to open a filing cabinet and who told too much of his business to a hardware store acquaintance when he should have kept his mouth shut. These are the actual facts of what happened, and the actual facts are what I have to work with. My wife's college fund for Marcus, the one she built dollar by dollar over 4 decades, is back in an account now. My son knows it exists. We've talked about putting it toward the kids' college the way she intended. We haven't made any decisions yet. There's time. Last Tuesday, my grandson looked up from the birdhouse we were failing to build and asked me if I used to make things with his grandma. I told him we made a lot of things together. He asked if I missed her. I told him every single day, but that missing someone you loved just meant you'd been lucky enough to have them. He thought about that for a minute. Then he asked if we could put a mailbox inside the birdhouse so the birds could get letters. I told him I thought that was the best idea I'd heard in a long time. If you felt something listening to this story, please subscribe to Pure Revenge Stories and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. There's more coming, and click on the box to hear the next one.